Liz Truss has been Prime Minister of the UK for about 3 weeks. In that time, the country's stock and bond markets have lost about $500 billion in value, and the British pound hit an all-time low against the dollar. The currency fell to the equivalent of $1.03 on Monday. The British pound has declined more than 5% over the last week and roughly 22% in the last 6 months. That is leading to concerns of even higher inflation in the UK, and even some of Truss's Conservative allies are blaming her policies for the latest downturn. Zanny Minton Beddoes now joins me for more. She's the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Zanny, we were supposed to be here to talk about this podcast and Xi Jinping, but then the pound did what it's doing. So I have to ask you, what's going on, and will the Bank of England step in, do you think?
Well, what is going on is precisely as you laid out very clearly. The UK the pound had been declining against the dollar, as many currencies have, because the story of this year has been the story of the strong dollar. But then last week, British Prime Minister Liz Truss decided that she was going to go with a kind of shock and awe programme of tax cuts. And she, or rather her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, announced the biggest tax cuts in 50 years, in half a century. And this in a country which, already had almost double-digit inflation. And Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are very clear adherents of Reaganism. They want to do to the UK what they think Reagan did here. But I think they've only read the first 2 chapters of the Reaganism book, and they know all about supply-side reforms, and they know all about tax cuts. And that's what happened here in the early 80s. But when Reagan did it, the dollar rose. That's because the US has the reserve currency. But the UK is a much smaller economy, and the pound is not the world's reserve currency, and investors really got worried. They thought, what is going to happen with this huge unfunded tax cut? So the pound, as you say, plunged to historic lows. It's now bounced back a little bit. But there is huge uncertainty in the UK, huge uncertainty about her credibility, whether she can survive politically. It's a mess.
Well, so the politically piece, is she under... some Conservatives didn't like this risk-taking on her part. Is that grumbling, or will that be an actual political problem for her?
No, I think it'll be a political problem. And she has managed to make, tax cuts to Conservatives feel problematic. And that is really quite an achievement. And I think the reason is the nature of the taxes that she cut, particularly the getting rid of the top rate of tax in the UK, which is paid only by the very wealthiest, the 45% tax rate. And so she made it look as though this pro-growth agenda that she's talking about is really a handout to the rich. And Britain needs higher growth. I'm with her all the way on that. There's a lot of things that need to be done, but I would have done much more supply-side reforms and not so much tax cuts of this sort.
All right, now the reason you're here in the first place to talk, who knows, the pound may fall and we may have to bring it back up again in this very conversation.
I love talking about the pound. Don't worry, the UK is really interesting at the moment.
It is, and Italy too. But I want to go to Xi Jinping because you've decided to do an 8-part podcast on Xi Jinping. Why this kind of investment? What kind of story are you trying to tell?
Well, Xi Jinping is, if not the most powerful man in the world, certainly one of the 2 most powerful men in the world. He is the sole and supreme leader almost of China. He's been there for 10 years, and the Party Congress, which comes up in a couple of weeks, he is almost certainly going to be, given another 5 years and effectively leader for life. So we wanted to explain the story of Xi Jinping because for the man who is one of the most powerful people in the world, he's really little understood. And he controls China, has really clamped down, increased the party's power, increased his own power. And so we wanted to try and understand who the man was, how he wields power, how his story helps explain to you what kind of person he is. It's just very hard for China. In fact, Chinese journalists can't do that.
Exactly. It's the origin story. But if you were a Chinese journalist, you could not tell the story.
Absolutely could not do that. And this is part, for me, of a much broader investment in China coverage, because China is extraordinarily important right now to the world. Geopolitically, economically, and yet it's really quite ill understood. Imagine how much we know about the US. I, as a Brit, we know a huge amount about the US. We know very little about what's really going on in China because it's incredibly hard with the censorship, with the clampdown on the media to report on China. We've long invested in China. We have a terrific China team. We've been doubling down on it. I've increased the number of journalists. I've been investing in China. And we are doing a lot more on China, both business, economics, data journalism. And this podcast is really a sort of, a down payment on the ambition of our journalism.
Right.
And it's, as you say, it's 8 parts, 30, 40 minutes each part. I hope you've managed to listen to some of it. It launches tomorrow on any Apple, Spotify. You can get it anywhere. And it's it's, I think, a really terrific piece of journalism. A team of people spent almost all year on this. Deep, deep dive.
So we're in the same business, which is to look at China and figure out how to break it into its component parts and then how much attention to pay to each of those component parts. So as you're doing that, as you're thinking about your coverage, what are the big sets of questions for China and its ambitions going forward that you would want to make sure your journalists are covering and that smart people will pay attention to?
So I think we want to understand Xi, the party, the nature of domestic control. We want to understand the economy. The economy is really important right now because for the last 20 years, Chinese economy has grown steadily, strongly, leading people to think that it's going to overtake the US. It's in real trouble right now. Yeah. Zero COVID, which is something that Xi has really pushed, the clamping down on COVID, coupled with a huge property crash, means the economy is looking pretty ropey. And if you look out into the medium term, its demography is not very good. So China
because it's shrinking.
Absolutely, yes. Have we hit peak China? What does a weaker China economy look like? And then, of course, there's the whole geopolitics. Taiwan, for China, that is, and for Xi himself, getting Taiwan back again is an enormous part of what he is about. So geopolitically, economically, business, innovation, they are determined to, be at the center of power in the 21st century. They want to be tech giants. They are tech giants already, but they're really clamping down on that. In all these areas, understanding China, doing it in a kind of rigorous, objective, authoritative way is very hard because it's very hard to report there, but I think incredibly important.
All right, Zanny Minton Beddoes, we'll have a lot to talk about when you're on this side of the Atlantic next time. Thanks for being here.
Great to see you.